All right. It looks like the people joining has slowed down a little bit, and I don't want to keep the rest of you waiting, so we'll get started as folks are, coming on. Um, we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. So thank you all for coming. This is the Managing Protected Areas in a Changing Ocean Request for Proposals webinar. My name is Sarah Close. I am a program officer at the Lenfest Ocean Program, where I manage our climate impacts on oceans grant-making portfolio, of which this RFP is part. And I'll be joined a little bit later on by Emily Knight, who's our outreach manager, and we'll be talking a little bit about engagement in the projects. And then potentially during the Q&A, we may have a few other folks pop on. We've got a number of people from our team here today. So I'll start, if I can advance the slides, there we go, with a couple virtual housekeeping notes before we get going. As you saw when you entered, we are recording this webinar. The recording will be posted on our website and our YouTube channel. It will show up on YouTube first. And we're recording the entire webinar, so the Q&A will be recorded as well. Participants are muted, and so if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box on Zoom. And we'll try to, reach all the questions. I think we'll have plenty of time for questions towards the end of the webinar. And there's also a chat box, but if you can try to keep your questions in the Q&A box, that'll help us track what we've gotten to. So today's webinar will cover some background and details about the RFP and a little bit about sort of as a program, how we got to this point. I do want to be very clear. Please refer to the PDF of the request for proposals that's on our website for more information, or for if you need to refer back to any of this. All the information about the RFP that I'll talk about here, and especially like the details and how to submit and all of that, is in the RFP, and it's fairly detailed. So I want to make sure that people are looking towards that document for guidance. And then we will have another webinar or Q&A session, really, December 14th, and it will not be recorded, and we are not planning to do a presentation. That's really just a chance for folks to come and ask questions of us as they're developing their proposals. So the link on our website that I think someone just shared in the chat is where you can also register for that Q&A session. If it's at a time zone that is absolutely not going to work for you, please just email us at info@lenfestocean.org with your questions. We're really trying to respond to all the questions there as well. But if you can, just come to the Q&A session. That'll be the easiest, but we recognize it might be in the middle of the night for some people. All right, so I thought I'd start by giving a little bit of a sense of who we are at the Lenfest Ocean Program, and why we're doing this and what we're interested in. So as many of you may know, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that is based at the Pew Charitable Trusts in Washington, D.C. And we fund scientific research that's really designed to inform people who can use information in their decision-making or deliberation, or in their roles in marine conservation or marine science-related fields. We fund research in a way that engages users at the very beginning. So this diagram kind of illustrates some of the ways that we make sure that our research that we support is developed and conducted with many different people and perspectives. During the project idea stage, in developing ideas and research questions, we aim to hear from the scientists who might be conducting the research, but also people who can use it on the ground, like fisheries managers, protected area managers, and other types of stakeholders or users that are kind of illustrated in these little cartoons. Once projects are funded, then they are designed to be very collaborative. So some of these users then are participating throughout the research in various ways, through engagement activities, as well as through being embedded in the project at times. And it goes on into sharing information as research products come out, and making sure that the way the information is shared is really appropriate and timely to the decisions being made and what users on the ground really need. And ideally, this all ends up in a place where decisions can be based on useful and usable science, because the science was supported at the beginning to involve the people who would use it. And so it is sort of applicable to their needs and timely, and helps get science into those conversations. So typically, we do this process of developing a research project and supporting it and working with our grantees on the engagement side for one project at a time. And we work closely with our grantees as the projects move forward to ensure that these connections are being made, or to help make sure engagement plans are kind of built into project ideas. And Emily manages our outreach team at Lenfest, which works really closely with our grantees throughout the life of projects. So in the case of the RFP, we're doing something that's a little bit different for us. Here we're aiming to expand on this model of funding use-driven science, but funding more projects on one topic. And we're really looking to you to propose ideas that you think are well suited to this call for proposals, and could fill really important needs in this field and on the ground where you work. So we'd expect ideas in this request for proposals to really keep in mind the central importance of engagement and partnerships throughout the projects and key relationships. This is really important to us as a program, and you'll hear that throughout the webinar today. So how did we get here? Managing protected areas in a changing ocean is a really critical issue in the field of marine conservation. It's something that at the Lenfest Ocean Program we've been scoping for the past couple of years, really centered around this question of how can we manage marine protected areas in ways that account for and adapt to the impacts of climate change. There's a lot of interest in this topic, and we heard a lot about that over the past few years. But there's also a lot of research needs and really limited information in some places to help meet those needs and address these central questions. We know that MPAs are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and in some cases, they can also confer resilience to those impacts under certain circumstances. They're also increasingly being implemented as a spatial management tool. So we're hearing a lot from managers who are increasingly faced with questions of what they should be doing, how they can adapt and prepare and better understand the shifting landscapes or seascapes that they manage. So that's really what we have centered our scoping around and our aim to understand the needs in this space. And throughout that process of scoping this issue, we decided to actually bring people together and hear more about some of the research needs in this space, to understand diverse perspectives on this issue and help us really clarify the needs for new research and generate new ideas for that research. So in September, we held virtual scoping sessions, which many of you may have participated in, to hear from more people who work on this topic from a variety of different perspectives, from people who manage a single MPA, people who might manage a network, or at a larger governance scale, people from NGOs, scientists from various disciplines, and government researchers and managers. So we had about 70 different participants from those different fields, and we learned a lot about this topic and even more perspectives than we had previously been able to garner. We structured this in basically two different kind of buckets. We spent some time understanding the challenges in this space, exploring and kind of clarifying what those are, and then identifying research questions and priority research needs in this space. So on the challenges, and I don't think some of these won't come as surprises to any of you, and some are probably pretty similar for other aspects of natural resource management under climate change. But we heard a lot of various challenges that people are facing in this space, around managing systems that are changing in new ways, managing under and communicating uncertainty in these systems and uncertainty in what the effects of some MPAs are when faced with climate impacts, There are certainly huge challenges around funding and capacity gaps that impact our ability to, think about some of these issues and address them in certain places. And then we heard a handful of challenges related to how research can actually connect to needs on the ground, and that's um, really important to the Lenfest Ocean program, and some places where we think we could help advance the field. So both understanding sort of how research could connect to those needs, the timeliness of research, and how the sort of timelines of research could better align with what managers need. And then also around, an incomplete understanding of what some available management options to adapt might be and how effective some of those might be in different places. This is certainly not an exhaustive list of challenges, but these are some of the things that came up in those scoping sessions that really helped us understand, what some people are facing in this field and where some of the research gaps are that actually could help move the ball forward on some of these challenges. So the second half of our scoping sessions was really driven around these questions of how can research help address these challenges. We aimed to brainstorm research questions and get sort of as many ideas out there as we could, and then really think about, well, what are the priorities? What ones, which research questions, if you could address them, would actually really help advance our ability to incorporate climate considerations into MPA management. So sometimes we think about it in the sense of, imagine it's 2050 or 2030 or even fewer years from now. What might it look like to successfully address some of these challenges and actually, start to make progress on incorporating climate considerations into MPA management? So the input that we got from these scoping sessions, and in particular the conversations around research needs, directly informed our development of 4 topical priorities for the RFP. So I'll go through each of these, but I want to note they're also in the RFP document in a fair amount of detail. The first is really monitoring ecosystem changes to inform management responses. This is getting at how can we detect early signs of ecosystem change, and then how can that be built into management responses or management options? Activities in this category should go beyond just including a monitoring component, although we recognize the importance of monitoring, to also think about what do you do with that information once you have it. The second area here is incorporating climate considerations into protected area management. Activities in this priority should provide some tangible demonstration of how to do this, how to actually incorporate climate change into MPAs in a given place, whether that's a single MPA, an MPA network, or some other sort of logical grouping of marine protected areas. To actually provide examples and build our understanding of what it takes to do this in different types of settings. The third area looks at some intersections of communities and MPAs. So some of the social ecological impacts of climate change and their intersection with MPA management. And activities in this category would really look at things in sort of what I think of as 2 directions. So you could think about, climate change impacts on MPAs having consequences for the communities that are sort of associated with them or rely on them. On the other hand, you could think about climate impacts on communities having consequences for how people in those communities use the MPAs, and how resource use might change. And so really for this one, looking at getting at some of those connections and just really better understanding that. I think there's some really interesting research questions there, and a lot of research knowledge gaps. But what we're really looking for is, ways to get at these questions that still address needs on the ground and engage these people and communities through collaboration. And then finally, there's a category about enabling conditions for MPA governance and adaptation under climate change. And here we're looking at really understanding what are some of the key components of MPA governance that could help address or help be sort of enabling conditions for managing for climate change. And how can we better understand the effectiveness of various adaptation options to achieve effective, equitable, and climate-informed outcomes in MPAs? I should stress here, while we're talking about these priorities, a proposal does not need to address only one of these, nor should they aim to address all of them. You can pick and choose which ones make sense. You do not have to tell us, I select number one or something like that. So for this RFP, the focus, as you may have gathered as I've been talking, is really on managing existing MPAs. We take a fairly broad view to the definition of MPAs in this RFP, because we recognize there's so many different forms of spatial protection, and what they're called varies in different countries, in different places around the world. So we're looking at places that are places in the ocean, estuaries, or coasts that are protected in some way. It can also be MPA networks, like I said. It doesn't have to be just one single MPA. And we have a fairly broad geographic scope. We do not have geographic limits for this competition, but we do ask that proposals tell us why they're working in the place that they have proposed to work, so that we can have some understanding or articulation of the setting. But we have not predetermined what that should be here. There's a few things that are outside of the scope of this call for proposals. One is areas not yet under any form of protection. So areas that are not yet MPAs, aren't considered part of this RFP, or research about how to design MPAs or MPA networks is also considered outside of the scope here. And then finally, we're not interested in funding work on climate mitigation or carbon sequestration potential of MPAs. We recognize those are really important areas. There's a lot of people doing really great work there, but it's outside of the scope of this effort today. So in your proposal, in the RFP, you'll see that we have available funding for two different types of projects. So I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. We have both research grants and planning grants available to apply for. A research grant can be up to 2 years and up to $400,000 total award. And a research grant would be a fairly typical sort of research project that should entail, substantial research activities with, clear research questions and methods described in the proposal. And it should build in active engagement throughout the process. We very much think of the engagement process as a critical part of the entire research project. And Emily's going to talk about that in just one second, a little bit more. For planning grants, these would be shorter term projects up to 1 year and up to $100,000 in total award. And these are really meant to get at some of the needs that arise before you're ready to say that you know what the research questions are in a given space and you can put together a research project. Sometimes you need time and space and funding to actually build those relationships, do some of the stage setting and engagement to understand how research can fit in a given place. So that's what this planning grant is meant to address. It can include different types of planning activities, relationship building, stage setting. It can include a variety of different activities. The proposal should speak to why those activities have been put together as meeting the needs of the planning grant. But they're not expected to undertake research activities. However, because our program does have research as a central component, these projects should still relate to understanding research needs, information gaps, or use of information in a given setting. So I am going to throw it over to Emily now to talk a little bit more about this piece of the building engagement into your projects or into your proposals.
Thanks, Sarah. And you can hear me okay, right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so building engagement into the project, in some ways, this can be an area where Lenfest as a grant maker is a little bit different than many other funders who are funders of research, who tend to focus on the structure and design of the methods and the results and all of that in the proposal stage. We focus on both that as well as trying to look ahead to how that information can be taken up in some kind of management process. And we try to then build into the structure of the project the potential to have those relationships and have that kind of engagement in it to set the results up for just greater success in actually informing decisions. Now, what that looks like in the context of a project varies by project. It depends on, the place that you're working, the needs as they exist, the management process that you are looking to inform. What are, the timelines associated with that, who is involved with that you would need to engage with, what form should that engagement take, and that those are the aspects that will vary depending on the situation. But we want to encourage folks in their proposals of thinking through that and proposing concrete ways to have that engagement built in. So examples from other projects, and again, it's all need dependent, have been, we're going to need to have an advisory committee of managers that we convene, or, the management process for, say, X fishery looks like this, happens on X timeline, and has these inputs for scientific information. And so we will need to present at these meetings or brief these decision makers at these particular times. And we want to build that into the life of the project. And I think so those are just a couple of examples. And I think the important thing to emphasize is we not only want you to think through that, but also try to budget for that in the grant itself. And Sarah mentioned in the beginning a little bit about me and my team. I lead the outreach team at the Lenfest Ocean Program, and that's a 3-person team, including me. And we work with our grantees once the projects get funded to try to continue to complement and build on that engagement throughout the life of the project. For this particular call, we want to emphasize a little bit more building the engagement in and budgeting for the engagement in the grant itself. And then my team and whatever partners, if you get, that we form, if you get funded, we'll be working with you to think about, in particular, what is the messaging, what is the convening, who should do the convening, whatever kind of puts you as in a position to best inform the management process. So it's very much from the scoping all the way through the life of the projects themselves that we want to be trying to think about how the information can be taken up and to be efficient and maximize people's time. That's a little bit more about how it works with the research projects. The planning grants, of course, will be a little bit different in the sense that that's more of the stage setting. That's more thinking through what that looks like and how information can be taken up. But we will also be working with those teams depending on what gets built into the planning grant itself and how to maximize that and position you well to either move on to having a fuller project or whatever it ends up looking like. So that's some of the engagement that we think about. And I can't say a lot of specifics. Obviously, it will depend on what kinds of projects we end up funding, what scale they function on, what management processes they're trying to inform. But I think the key thing to emphasize is we do our best to think about it from the beginning, and it kind of helps head off surprises, but it also helps us adapt projects as they go. Things inevitably change over the course of a year or 2 years, and we're often in a better position to evolve with that when we are, constantly looking ahead to our goals and planning backwards. And so that's a little bit about the engagement piece. And we wanted to emphasize it because we know that other requests for proposals or whatever will often call for or have a line about outreach of some kind. But for us, it's a little more involved than just say, I would be willing to present to different places. We really want people to think deeply about not only what is the right question, but also like, if we were to answer that question, how could that information be used? And oftentimes you end up with multiple audiences than even just one management process to kind of help set up science for success. So that's a little bit about the engagement piece. And we are here to, not just provide advice on that in the form of the outreach team, but provide some capacity for that too. And so if it's built into the grant and budgeted for, and then you have some of the capacity of our outreach team kind of guiding that process, doing some of the legwork, and we can often go a lot farther than we would have been able to. So I will turn it back to you, Sarah, to continue on.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about just some of the more logistical steps in the process of the RFP, and then we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I want to again emphasize to read the full request for proposals and the budget spreadsheet that's also linked on our website carefully. Most of this information you can also find there. And so that's always a great place to go for information. So eligibility, specific eligibility criteria are outlined on page 5 of the RFP. I'm not going to go through them right now. I just want to point out that you do not need to actually submit anything to us at this stage in terms of financial statements or anything else proving that you're eligible. We include this to make sure that you're not going through the work of pulling together an entire proposal and only to find that you weren't eligible. So it's really, we put the onus on you to go through these criteria, go through them with your institution if you need to make sure that you are eligible for this competition. If you have questions that are, specific to your situation, you can always feel free to ask questions on this webinar, but if you have questions that are more specific or sensitive, you can feel free to email us at info@lenfestocean.org. We have a number of people tracking that email address, so that's a better one to use than any one of our individual email addresses. So I mentioned earlier the letter of intent stage for this competition. Letters of intent are optional for this competition. We do not require them, but they are a chance for you to get some early feedback as you're developing your proposal on whether your idea is a good fit with the priorities in this competition. We do not anticipate sending, we will not send detailed feedback on like the technical merit of your proposal or how good we think it is or anything like that. It's just to tell you, yes, this is a good fit, it aligns with what we're asking for, proceed, or we don't think this really fits what we're asking for, or it could be something in the middle of like, you applied for a planning grant, but it's more like a research grant or vice versa. So we will provide some basic feedback about the fit with the competition priorities at that stage. And we are going to do our best to get that feedback to you very quickly. The deadline for LOI submission is November 30th. You're welcome to submit sooner than that. They can just be submitted to info@lenfestocean.org, and all the instructions are on what to include are in the RFP. I do want to mention for any people outside of the US who are submitting, the week before this deadline is the US Thanksgiving holiday, so many people on our team will be out of the office that week. So just wanted to give folks a head up. If you have questions about the LOI, send them sooner rather than later. The other thing I just want to quickly mention about the LOI is that because it is optional, it will not be considered in the final proposal review stage. So we will not be sharing the LOIs with anybody outside of our core team, including other people who are reviewing the proposals. And we won't be going back to them to like look at what kinds of feedback we gave and whether you aligned with it. So it's really up to you to submit a proposal. The LOI is just a chance to get some feedback on that. So the proposal is clearly the most important part of this whole process. The proposal and the budget spreadsheet must be submitted via email to info@lenfestocean.org. All the information on what to include is in the RFP. We will not consider proposals that do not come with their budget spreadsheet also. So make sure you're downloading both of those documents from the website. The budget spreadsheet template is an Excel document. And let us know if you have any problems with that document. But those are the two things you will need to submit via email. by the deadline, January 23rd. All right, so then I also want to talk a little bit about how these projects will be evaluated. You can find online, and it's linked in the RFP as well, and I think someone will share the link in the chat too, a more detailed table of our grant criteria and some example questions we use as we're evaluating project ideas. For the evaluation of these proposals, there's detailed information on page 11 of the RFP. We essentially have 5 different categories we'll be looking at. 3 of those are weighted equally, and those are scientific, technical, and research, which really gets at the methods and approaches that you're using. Are they feasible? Are they sound? Do they have clear goals that can be accomplished through the activities that you're proposing here? And are they relevant to the scope of work for the RFP? So that's really looking at like the technical merit of the proposal. There's also a usable science criterion that gets at how well the proposed activities align with the user context, the landscape of decision making that you're aiming to address or provide information to inform, the needs of those users, and are the outputs that you're proposing to produce going to be useful or usable to the people who you think need them. Engagement is similar, but really looks at what are the engagement activities that you've included in your proposal. Are they appropriate to what you're trying to do or your project goals? Do they involve key audiences or have a plan to build relationships with some of those audiences if you don't already have them? And that really gets at a lot of what Emily was just talking about as well. So those 3 are all kind of equally weighted, and we think that they're all really important things to think about as you develop your project idea. And then we also will look at project team and what qualifications they have, mostly looking to ensure that the project team has the appropriate skill set to complete the activities that they've proposed, and including, all the sort of different types of expertise you might need. And then in the budget, that the budget is aligned with what you need to do the project and that engagement is adequately budgeted for. So if you have, key engagement events or people who you plan to work with a lot, think about how you can include that in the budget and make sure that we're paying for the time of people or the work of people who are, helping with the engagement work as well. I did want to say one other thing, which is that we are not requesting letters of support for these projects. And in fact, because we're not requesting them, we actually will not be reviewing letters. It should be clear throughout your proposal, and you should include information in the proposal that you have relationships with the people who, or organizations who you will be working with, and build that into the project narrative itself. But you do not need to submit any letters of support for this competition. Okay, and then just a quick note about what will happen after selection, after award selection. So we anticipate, trying to review proposals as quickly as we can. Once we have selected a set of research and planning grants to move forward with, we will get in touch to schedule a video or teleconference to discuss the project. Often we find it's really helpful to hear from the project team about how they developed their proposal or their idea, to share any feedback that we have from our review process and other reviewers, and any revisions that we would like to see before moving forward, which would most likely be fairly minor at this stage. Then we will invite you to submit a proposal via Pew's online grants portal. So this is the point in the process where the university financial contacts or other financial contacts at your institution or the institution where the grant will go would get involved to submit the required supporting documents like financial audits. We do not require you to do any of that before this stage. So if you're submitting a proposal, by January 23rd, you don't have to have gone through your university review unless your university requires it. We don't get to supersede any institutional requirements, but it's not required by us. And then our goal is to get grants signed by both PU and the grant host institution no later than June 30th, 2023. So it will be a relatively quick turnaround process, but we're hoping to move these through relatively quickly. And then, of course, as we select people to move forward, you will also hear if you were not selected. So you don't have to sort of wait wondering for too long. So very quickly, because I know I've thrown a lot of logistics at you and I want to, make sure we have plenty of time for questions. This is just all the important dates for this process. So the LOI deadline is coming up November 30th. There will be a Q&A webinar December 14th. Proposals are due January 23rd. Projects are anticipated to start no sooner than July 1st, 2023, and that's just to make sure we have plenty of time to get the grant awards in place. And projects cannot end any later than June 30th, 2025. So research projects especially do need to be sort of limited to that time frame. Planning grants are expected to only be 1 year, so you could have a planning grant start a little bit later as long as it ends by June 30th, 2025. That is fine. And with that, I'll just go to this last slide with the penguins. We do have the Q&A webinar. And then please use our personal contacts are here too, but actually it's better to use the info@lenfestocean.org email for questions about the RFP, because there's multiple people, keeping track of that email and following it. So it's more likely to get found, especially as many of us have time out of the office coming up in the coming weeks. And I will stop there, and maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see people or see, I don't know, our team and look at the questions. There we go. Of course, now I can't find the screen. There we go. Now it's at the right place. All right, it looks like we have a bunch of questions and things in the chat box. So I think the chat was just us, so that's good.
Yeah, everything in the chat are resources we shared.
Great. So it looks like I'll answer the first question that I see is, how come carbon sequestration is out of the scope of this call? And does that mean it might be part of a future program? That's a great question. So, essentially that's out of the scope of this call for a couple of reasons. One is that there are lots of other groups working on those topics, and we felt like, they're fairly well covered by others, including many other funders. And we had to limit the scope of this call some way, and we don't have a limit on the geographic scope, and so focusing it on management of existing MPAs in the sort of climate adaptation space is the way we've decided to sort of narrow the scope of this call. It is not an indication of any future plans Lenfest has in that space. It's really just aiming to provide some boundaries on the types of work we might fund, so we get a more appropriate set of proposals. Oh, this is a long one, so I'll read it out loud. What if we have a project that has a planning component to coordinate and disseminate findings to a larger region, but conduct the research component within a network of MPAs? The research project could be started at the same time as the regional management coordination, as the research questions and outreach engagement plan are ready, but we would like to share findings and create a way to share findings across ecological boundaries rather than jurisdictional. If so, would you submit separately or submit as one? And would the 400K cap be the cap? That's a great question and something I should have mentioned, so I'm glad someone asked about it. We will not fund multiple projects from the same researcher or research team. So in this case, with this example, as far as I understand it, we would expect any planning activities that would need to be part of the process to be part of that engagement that's built into your research project. So you would submit one research planning grant for $400,000 in this case. We wouldn't consider funding like a planning grant and then a research grant to the same team to do like a, you know, really similar research. I hope that helps. All right. Does the grant have a cap or a maximum ceiling of funds that will be dispersed for the duration of this grant? I'm assuming this is asking about the program, not the individual research grant cap of 400K and planning grant cap of 100K. For the program, we anticipate funding. It's a little tricky because we don't know the balance of research and planning grants that we will want to support out of this call. So we anticipate funding, depending on that balance, like 2 to 4 research grants and potentially 2 to 4 planning grants. Beyond that, I can't get that much more specific because we've never done an RFP before. So we actually have no idea how many proposals to expect in this process, but I hope that gives you a sense of, you know, approximately the number of projects we kind of aim to move forward here. And we do plan to have a combination of both. So we will be funding at least some research projects and at least some planning grants, because we're really excited to see, you know, both of those options being used. And we're hoping people are excited to apply for different aspects. And that kind of answers the next question too, so I'll keep moving. Our potential question: can we use carbon neutral electrolysis to help MPA ecosystems survive centuries of marine heat waves and ocean acidification? I don't know what carbon neutral electrolysis is, so I'm not going to speak to the, you know, whether this would be suitable or not. And in general, we're trying to sort of veer away from telling people like, yeah, that's a good idea, or no, it's not a good idea. You're welcome to reach out to me separately. Maybe I'll say that to provide a little bit more background. But I think if you read the scope of work and you think you can make a case for this fitting within the topical priorities that we've outlined, then it's, you know, you're welcome to develop that proposal and submit it. I would highly recommend putting together an LOI so that we could maybe get a better sense of what you're thinking. Charlotte, go ahead.
Sarah, if you would like a break from talking, why don't I read a question or two and then you can answer, unless they're more appropriate for me to answer. Okay. Thank you. So the next question: thank you for focusing on these excellent climate change questions. Some of our research, particularly on connectivity and movement, have suggested the need for more MPAs strategically placed to create a network of MPAs that work collectively to conserve marine resources. It sounds like that question is out of scope of this RFP, correct?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at like any questions around how would you design an MPA or how would you design a network, that's not something we're considering for this RFP. If the questions are more around an existing MPA or an existing network and, you know, what are the options, then I think that is in the scope. But if it doesn't exist yet, we're not considering that.
Okay, next question. I see that the eligibility requirements state that the Lenfest Ocean Program cannot support individuals with current funding from the Pew Charitable Trusts as of the start date for this RFP. Does this refer to PIs who have current funding or institutions as a whole with current funding?
Great question. That refers just to the PI. So we can provide funding to, you know, the same institution, but we can't fund the same investigator. And I should clarify, it means as of the start date of your project, not like the issuance date of the RFP. I'm not sure if that's totally clear in that wording.
I think we talked a little bit about how many proposals we anticipate. So the next question is I think the question is, how established does the governance of the MPA need to be? That's a good question.
That is a good question. From our perspective, the MPA needs to be in existence. It needs to be established. It doesn't need to be like perfect or like fully, you know, 5 years in and know everything that they're doing. But it can't be, that's sort of our way of distinguishing whether it is existing or like you're thinking about the design of an MPA. So as long as the MPA is like established in some, you know, formal way, then that works for us. We are certainly, I don't think we're really in a position to like know the full, governance structure of all the MPAs out there. So we would look to you to really describe that in your proposal.
I think
And I would say,
oh, good.
oh, was that Emily? Sorry, Emily, I can't see you in
Sorry.
Q&A. I was just going to say, I think also with that one, it's whether there are individuals or entities who can take up and use the information that's being produced. So, while not every MPA is going to have even a management plan or governance in place, are there individuals who can act on the information that you are finding from your research questions to support that MPA's management, or to create that MPA's management if it's not as strong as it could be? Okay, sorry, Emily, did you?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
That's good. That's a good sign. I never introduced myself. Sorry, Charlotte Hudson, Lenfest Ocean Program. A little late to the. I'm just chiming in here. A little late to the game. Okay, next question. Is there a benefit of having international teams? This could be in terms of looking at a set of MPAs which cover different countries, for example, the Mesoamerican Reef System, or getting external knowledge from overseas research organizations to support work in MPAs.
There's not a benefit in that we're not going to be evaluating based on whether or not you have international teams or international focus. It's really about explaining to us why the proposed activities you put forward are the right thing to do to fill the need that you've identified. So it's more about sort of articulating, like, if you're looking in, multiple different countries, how does that help address user needs on the ground or the needs of the managers who you're working with? But it's not something that we're going to prioritize over, a domestic team working on a single MPA. It's more about how you put together the entire process and how you engage with users.
Great. Next question. Thanks for clarifying that only one grant could be awarded per PI. Related question. Can a PI submit multiple proposals?
Yes, a PI can submit multiple proposals or beyond multiple proposals. It's hard to say. But we'd also encourage you to think about where your time is best used. So, keep that in mind as well.
Next question. Do you accept co-funding from grantees?
So we don't require any sort of matching funds or, leveraging other work. You should ensure that the project that you propose to us can be accomplished with the funding you're asking for from us. If there's other existing activities going along with it that, makes sense to tell us about as you're describing kind of the background and the context, like, of course, that's useful information for us to know. And I would think that should be part of your proposal. But we want to make sure that we are funding projects that can be accomplished with the funding we're providing, if that makes sense.
Or that other funding is already secured. But yes, as what Sarah said. The next question has multiple parts, I think, because part of the webinar was missed. So I'm just going to answer these a little bit as I go to the fact that I know the answer. I have a few questions. Please confirm research should focus on existing MPAs, not planning future MPAs. That's correct. Research should focus on existing MPAs. Number 2, is budgeting for community engagement required? It's a small budget in total and you feel difficult to balance research funds and community involved expenses. The answer is yes. Unless there are external funds or other ways that you are going to conduct the community engagement, which I think you could explain, we would expect to see some budget funds spent on, depending on your context, what that engagement structure looks like. We do feel strongly that individuals who lend their time from communities to address these research questions do get compensated, maybe not entirely in equal measure as the research PIs, but that do receive compensation along those means, if that is appropriate in your system. And lastly, initial idea form should be sent to info@lenfestocean.org.
Yeah, and for that, the final piece, in the RFP, you'll see detailed information about what to submit, how, and when. So if there's any other questions about that, do feel free to like fall back on the RFP for those instructions as well.
And all the resources are in the chat, so you can get that there.
Yep.
I would say the next question actually is following up on the carbon neutral process that was discussed earlier. I would suggest, Mark, for you just to reach out to us individually. We can just, or to send an email with a question to info@Lenfest, because I'm not sure we can answer your question at this time. And then the last question, sorry to follow up on the multiple grants per one location question. Did I hear correctly? Oh, did I hear correctly that there would not be an opportunity to follow up on a successful planning grant with a later research grant to follow on the planning ideas?
That's a great question. So we are not able to commit to following up on the planning grants with any future funding at this time. We would hope that the planning grants will help position you to get future funding from a funder, or to conduct, future activities with your partners, but that's not something we're able to commit to now.
Within the RFP, there are a few restrictions on target institutions. Can you confirm that government agencies and for-profit organizations can submit proposals?
Sorry, you're shaking your head, Charlotte.
Sorry, my understanding is that government agencies may not submit proposals. We have supported government scientists, but that the funding itself, I don't believe right now we are able to send directly to US or other governments. For-profit institutions, I believe, are eligible.
Yep.
Now I'm regretting signing up for reading all the questions. Okay, for the planning grants, to what extent are you interested? Exactly. For the planning grants, to what extent are you interested in supporting public engagement and MPA program reviews? Or is the primary focus on academic projects that address research/information needs?
I think in that case, I would definitely encourage you to submit an LOI. I think that you would need to explain to us how engaging in an MPA program review addresses the priorities in the call for proposals. So it's a little hard to speak to exactly what that would look like, but I think you just I would recommend putting it in an LOI, and we can give you feedback that way. Maybe that's probably the most straightforward thing to do.
Is it eligible to select one or more proposed MPAs, not yet legalized or gazetted, and its management plan and unit are still under development?
I think this falls under areas that are outside of the scope of the current call for proposals. So MPAs would really need to be established in a more of a formal way than just proposed to be eligible for this.
I think we've already answered. If we are awarded a planning grant in this round, will there be an opportunity in the future to apply for a research grant? I think we've
already addressed that and the next question, which is kind of the same.
Okay. After that, following up on Marta's question, would you consider questions around how to shift the boundaries of an existing MPA in response to climate change? It sounds like yes.
Yeah, I think that can be within the scope of the call. Yeah.
Okay. Will the planning grant be evaluated differently than research grants, especially in regard to the first of criteria of science technical merit?
Yeah, so we will take into account, obviously, that it's a planning grant, and that what you're expected to be talking about for a planning grant would be different in these proposals. But this is a great spot to draw your attention to the actual description of the proposal content in the RFP, which is fairly detailed. And for each of the categories in the project description, it actually describes where there should be kind of differences in what we'd expect to see in a planning grant versus a research grant. We have tried to articulate that pretty clearly in the RFP. So where you talk about research methods and analyses in a planning grant, that should describe the specific planning activities that you're going to do, what types of activities would be considered and that sort of thing. So we do talk about that a little bit more in the RFP, but yes, we will be, developing rubrics kind of separately for the research grants and the planning grants. They're not going to be fighting against each other.
Thank you for the nice session. In the topical priorities, socioeconomic was not touched on. This is significant due to the impact of MPAs on boarding communities. Does the grant cater for socioeconomic centric proposal with positive impacts on co-management and or governance?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe more of a terminology issue, but the topical priority number 3 can include socioeconomic considerations. Sorry, that's not clear in the language. But do feel free to include that in your proposal, and that is certainly something that we find important.
Next, would you fund research led by non-US institute or without any US eyes on the team?
Yes, international institutions are certainly allowed to apply, and we would fund them as well. We hope to.
Absolutely. And last question so far, does the PI need to be affiliated with a university?
No. You should look at the eligibility criteria and make sure that you could accept funds if you're selected, but you do not need to be at a university.
Excellent. With 3 minutes to spare, excellent group, excellent questions. Very much appreciated.
Great. Well, I think we're all done. Like I said, this will be recorded, so if you know of anyone who missed it, feel free to share the link once it's up. It'll be on YouTube first, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah and Emily.
All right, bye everyone.